Hey everyone, we've got a really fun episode today because I'm talking with Rob Connelly. Rob was previously the VP of Sales and Marketing at ActiveWall, but recently migrated into the SaaS space and is now the head of sales over at Vistio. He shares what that transition was like, as well as about his weekly podcast that he has called Revenue Team Live, where he discusses his take on things like building a customer centric revenue strategy, his philosophy on SDR and BDR roles, and lots more. Let's get into it.
So, Rob, it's great to have you on the show, man.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So, I thought maybe just for the audience, maybe you could just go through really quickly a little bit about yourself. Obviously, some new events here happening recently, and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my passion is to facilitate personal, professional, and revenue growth. That's kind of my personal mission statement. And everything that I do is kind of framed around those concepts. And so, I'm about to turn 40 here in a few months and kind of been thinking as I've been finishing up my 30s, have I really locked down the why that drives me?
Yeah.
And, kind of getting to that point where I realize that whatever time I've got left on this earth, I want to make sure that I'm spending it doing things that I actually will look back on and be glad I spent the time doing those things. So
Yeah.
at this point, I'm just pumped up about those three things about every minute of every day. And that goes from spending time with my kids all the way down to analyzing analytics and looking at close rates. So, all the things, as they
Right.
say.
Yeah. All
But
of the
that's
things.
me in a nutshell.
Hmm.
Just getting excited about applying that why
Hmm.
through the roles that I have with my company and with the companies I get to help on the side, and just people on LinkedIn that are kind of doing their own searches and trying to
Yeah.
figure out where they're at and how to help themselves. So
Yeah.
that's me in a nutshell.
That's cool, man. So, we were talking before the show a little bit about sort of the power of LinkedIn. And I thought what was interesting, and I had made this comment actually, and I said, it's sort of surprising, we all like you and I travel sort of like in the same circles, but we've never actually had a conversation, right? We've never actually had one of these things. And I think that the power of LinkedIn, right? The connections and the community that you build with like-minded people is just, it really, really evident. And, it's just, it's fun, right? You get to reach out like we did, like, a couple of weeks ago, we said, hey, let's hop on the show and, let's have a conversation. And you couldn't do this 5 years ago. Not really. Right.
Right.
There was so much more involvement and, production, and it was just a bigger lift, I think, across the board, which is why a lot of people still aren't doing it, right? And it's a lot easier now. The friction is much lower.
For sure. And I think as society is changing, and it is changing more rapidly now than it has ever changed, B2B and B2C buying and selling is changing.
Yeah.
And as we in the world of trying to figure out how to sell in an ethical and predictable and productive way, we need to be able to adapt to the way that society is changing and the way that individuals view the internet, the way that individuals view their own lives.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to be kind of on the front end of that
Yeah.
in my thinking. But at the same time, I've learned most everything that I'm thinking from other people that are willing to give away what they
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
And they're not asking for my email address in order to share some content. They're just putting their thoughts out into the world to better everyone.
Yeah.
And they're also often some of the best consumers of other people's content. And so, you get out there and you see, okay, who's posting content that isn't necessarily the prettiest or the most production value driven stuff, but that actually engages with critical topics related to the world, related to what they do. And you just take the time to consume that content, allow it to shape you, and then offer the same back for others as well. And along the way, you meet a lot of great people and build
Yeah.
relationships, and you end up with people that are in your corner and that understand your value and can help you remember when you forget your value, and
Yeah.
so it's a different world, really it is,
Yeah.
than even just 2 years ago, and not all in a good way, but in a lot of ways there's some good things going on.
Yeah. I think consumers of your content and then contributors to your content, right? Because they're consuming it and then they're turning around and then offering up their own opinion, advice, feedback, that it creates that, even if you've never met face to face, like you have a feel for sort of what their take is on the world. And I think that like nowhere have we ever had that before. So this is, I think really leads into maybe, sort of what you're doing with Team Revenue Live, right? Where you're saying, here's our philosophy, here's our take, here's what we do, right? And here's what we see. Maybe talk us through a little bit. So, about the podcast, what you're doing right now, and, what it's all about.
Yeah. So my first foray into sales and marketing in earnest, I was in charge of the entire go-to-market strategy for a building materials company. And when I say I was in charge of it, I mean there wasn't one when I showed up.
Right.
And it took very little time for me to realize the product market fit was amazing. The opportunity was, the scale possibility, total addressable market was enormous, but they had done like 20 sales in 7 years, right?
Yeah.
And they were thinking like a custom mom and pop shop, whereas they could be a national building materials manufacturer and needed to have a go-to-market strategy to match. So, as I built out marketing components like that first mobile-friendly website, and I had to field the leads that website and the paid social that we were doing actually brought in, I was refined, if you will, on both sides of the go-to-market strategy simultaneously. So I'm learning what's wrong with the marketing because I have to deal with the fallout.
I love that. I absolutely love that. So to that point, I was talking to our head of sales yesterday. I was down in Gainesville, in our office in Gainesville, and he was saying, he's like, the best salespeople that are on our floor are marketers, not trained marketers, but they've figured out how to be marketers, right? And so of course, like, we sell to marketers, that's what we do. Mm-hmm. And you know this, right? Like when you're talking to your prospect, when you're on the phone, or you're having a conversation Zoom, and you're going through your demo, you're going through your product, you're sort of coming alongside and helping them through their discovery process. If you are not really well attuned to what those pain points are that the other side of the phone is having, what ends up happening is it's like you're singing off key, right? And it just absolutely puts everybody, puts the, the other person off. And, I swear it's like half the reason, why AEs get ghosted. But I think, I'm exaggerating, but I think, I think that's absolutely true. And, when Greg said that yesterday, I was like, that's absolutely right. Right. You have, like, the best salespeople are folks that really understand how leads are driven, right? What the difference in quality, and they're not just on the receiving end, just doing demos all day, right? They're understanding like what's driving it, what the pain points are, how marketing is working all the way through. And they're seeing what leads are actually going to closed won versus, just leads, demos that they're sort of just cycling through and playing the numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of my biggest beliefs, Eric, is that industries can learn from one another in go-to-market. And whereas SaaS in particular tends to be on the cutting edge of new thinking and obviously new technologies because that's the space they're in.
Yeah.
Other industries lag behind in some of those areas, but they have some other values that they hold true to, that when you add that into SaaS, it enhances the go-to-market strategy to SaaS. And the inverse is also true, where, if you can think outside of the how you've always done it for just a minute and learn from some of the newer thinking with regard to how to engage with buyers, especially in a B2B context, from SaaS and other more forward-thinking industries, there's a lot of benefit in everyone getting to the table together and gleaning from one another. And that's one of the other goals for Team Revenue, is that we would not silo by industry, but rather benefit one another. So one of the things that's really unique about the space that I was in building materials is that, especially on the commercial side, because it was commercial and residential construction, on the commercial side, the architect was really the arbiter of the purchase. So you had to achieve
Mm,
specification by the architect.
yeah.
Well, guess what? The architect is going to ask you for technical files
Yeah.
to put into their drawings, but they don't want you to know their email address because they don't want to hear from you,
Yeah.
right? They want to remain anonymous, but they want access to your very sensitive technical drawings.
Yeah.
And so you have to find a way to, in that space, allow the buyer, which is really, although the financial side of the buying is going to be a contractor, the actual decision is being made by the architect to remain anonymous, to buy and research and engage with your product on their own terms.
Yeah.
And what's helpful about that translation to other industries is that's the way the entire society is going.
Yeah.
Increasingly, buyers, whether it's B2B or B2C, they don't want you to know who they are. And one of the reasons that I picked up on that beyond just the architects is that, what, Chris Walker and others call dark social or dark funnel, where you can't like you used to attribute your paid social
Yeah.
to your funnel. Well, I was seeing these huge jumps in direct and organic traffic as I was making investments in paid. And so, and it was always on a slight delay, and it was
Mm-hmm.
always
Mm-hmm.
specific segments that related to the
Yeah.
content and the
Yeah.
ICPs I was targeting. And so
Yeah.
at first I was like, what in the world is happening? Like,
Yeah.
why am I not getting this on the right channel? And then it
Yeah.
occurred to me, it's because if I'm a buyer, if I'm on Facebook or Instagram or another
Yeah.
platform, I'm interested in something that I see in an ad, I'm probably not clicking on that ad.
That's
I'm
right.
I'm probably opening another tab or opening up my browser if I'm on mobile, and I'm
Yeah.
flipping back and figuring out what that web URL was,
Yeah. I love that because obviously that's a trend right now. People, have been talking through like, what does that mean? And like, how do I sort of sell that to my executives, and who's, it, it's a, so it's funny, like I've been doing this for a long time. Like I started, this will tell you how old I am. So, I started my first company when I was 20, I think I was like 21, 20, something like that. And, no, maybe a little bit younger. Anyway, like it was in school, like I was in college and I was just, extra rent money, beer money.
Right.
And, it grew up, right? It actually sort of like we rode this wave of e-commerce. This is, late 90s. So that'll tell you, like I'm up there in age, but, and, like 2000s. And, anyway, we had a marketer who wasn't really a marketer at the time, right? This was like just a group of us who got together and we sort of stumbled into something that eventually grew into 60, $70 million in revenue. And we were a bunch of kids. We didn't know anything at the time. And this was all brand new, green field, right? And anyway, my point to saying all of that was we had somebody who was on our staff, and he's one of the smartest marketers I know. But he always used to say, and he said something similar to what you just said, which was he would be looking at the numbers across the different like channels, and this is before Google Analytics and everything else. And what he would say was, I don't know exactly what's happening, but whenever we do this, like, maybe it's like we would do like a radio ad or, TV, or we would do something like, a big promotion or something,
Mhm.
all of the boats would start rising, right?
Yeah.
All of the individual boats would start, and the channels would start rising. And he's like, I know what's causing it, but I can't track it. But if all the boats are rising roughly the same amount, I can go back, and sort of start, reverse engineering why it's happening. And then also maybe even get predictive about how those boats would rise and what its contribution to revenue was.
Yeah.
And that was really fascinating to me back then. And then, this is like 20 years later, whatever, right? And, we're talking about the exact same thing today. It's never changed. It's just we've never been able to articulate it really super clearly. And I think the Chris Walkers of the world, um, big fan of his, by the way. I think there's just a huge, um, I think there's just a huge sort of movement, that's happening where, this is a common conversation that is more easily described, I think, to not what I call non-marketing executives,
Yeah.
where this stuff is happening.
Yeah, and it's something that if we're being honest, is difficult to sell to the CFOs and the bean counters of the
Mm-hmm.
world, because they see the world very much in black and white as a draw the line between dots kind of experiment, right?
Right.
And I mean, in my experience, in building that go to market, if I had only listened to what I could attribute in the moment that I was
Yep.
spending it, it would have never grown.
Yep. Yep.
And it grew 10x in 3 years. I mean, with no budget.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of it was intuition.
Yeah.
A lot of it was listening to customers. And, the other thing that I think is really powerful is, the power of relationship, even in marketing. People would say, well, what's your ad spend? And I would say, okay, it's X. And they would say, it's really low. And I would say, that's right. But I'm engaging in content and with content on platforms with the ICP, so that whatever I'm spending, I'm getting a lot of engagement organically just because of my engagement with the humans.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so when you talk about B2B, being willing to actually engage in a conversation that is not directly leading to or sounding like a sales pitch, sets you apart, which is kind of sad on some level, and it's counterintuitive, especially to the bean counter mentalities, because, well, did you get your pitch in? Well,
Yeah.
no. So I've got this great story, and I love to tell it because I think it really rings to what we're talking about here, Eric. And that is, I went on one of those, sales development, relationship development trips that it's just a marathon, like 6 cities in 4 days, from East Coast to West Coast.
Yeah.
My Delta Sky Miles account is still thanking me for that one. Just it was like one of those whirlwind trips, and I met with all these different companies that could be distributors for our product. And it was just one of those moments where I felt really good coming off the airplane, getting home, because I knew I had built relationships from stage 1 to stage 3 or stage 2 to stage 4 all across the country. And that those relationships represented a large revenue increase potential. And so I got off the plane. Next morning, I'm in the office. One of the investors says, "Did you sell anything?" And I thought to myself, wow, he does not understand this business at all.
Yeah.
Because in order to build relationships, you can't come in just with a sales pitch. And in order to have sustainable growth in most B2B environments, relationship is what's going to give you the opportunity, A, to know the value that is needed to be provided, but B, to actually earn the right to be the one to provide that value. And, B2B is still selling to humans. And you still have human beings that are trying to get better at their job, or at least have a better day at their job, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want to buy from somebody they don't like. If you're irritating to them, or if you're not providing value to them, or if you don't seem to care about them, then you're just the irritating, message, or the irritating salesperson that they'd like to get rid of.
Yeah.
And so, I like that story just because it was a very dramatic experience for me, but also because if you think about it, if CEOs, CFOs, major shareholders in smaller companies don't understand how this works, then you have this tension.
Yep.
Where it's like, I need to show short-term vanity metrics now. But ultimately, those same people that are calling and clamoring for those things often are very dissatisfied with the long-term revenue results of those activities. And so getting through the fog of justifying your existence this week to let's look out 3-4 quarters from now is very, very difficult.
It is the most nerve-wracking, scary thing for a marketer and for the sales leader to undergo the sort of transition that you're talking about, because pipeline is affected. as you make the shift, as you make that transition. It's different if you're starting from scratch in some ways, right? It's a different sort of anxiety that you have. The anxiety is I'm putting my dollars into this and I'm not going to see immediate returns on it. And there's a window of opportunity, that I'm going to have. And does the leadership have enough appetite for that, that risk? And we could talk about like how you keep executives sort of in line with the thinking and keeping them updated and keeping them aware and informed and, constant touch points to just keeping that. But then when you make the change, so I was talking with a sales leader yesterday, and he called me up and he said, "Hey, look, I've just taken this new role, and it's a big company. They're, I can't mention the name, but it's, it's a huge business where their CAC is just out of control, and they are 100% outbound, and that is." And the first thing he did, and to his credit, and I mean, it was an amazing conversation, because he called me up. He's like, "Hey, this can't work, right? We can't be doing this. Like, how would we go about standing up a true, what I call a high intent funnel, right? And so full funnel marketing, high intent from beginning to end." And the thing I counseled him on before we hung up was just like, "Hey, look, it's nerve wracking, first of all, and you got to have exec buy-in, and you gotta just be able to have the appetite for it. But it is absolutely doable in the way that the best, smartest way to do it is sort of say, let's take the dollars on a very small scale. Let's take some of the dollars from basically the outbound SDR team, and just carve out a small piece of those, and stand up a very small, again, it depends on your appetite for growth, right? But stand up a very small high intent funnel. And it's not that, it's surprisingly inexpensive just to get it started, to show show the results, and then show that it scales, and then you rapidly stack from there. And but like when you're in that, it's kind of like this, and then it starts building on the other side. But when you're down here in the trough, it's nerve wracking.
Yeah. But the trough is coming.
Yeah.
And it's something that, in theory, if you're at that stage of getting buy-in on that, change of philosophy, you've got to make it real clear how low the low is going to be, because ultimately it's like when you're trying to take off through cloud cover, there's a point where you're depending on the instruments and you're blind and you can't actually see in front of the plane. If you're the pilot, you're going to come out on the other side of the clouds.
Yeah.
So you're not saying to the people behind you, "Hey, this is your captain speaking. We're never coming out of these clouds." No, you're saying, "Hey, a little bit of cloud cover here. We should get above the deck in about 10 minutes." Or you reassure them, you help them see, "Hey, we're going to go through this period here."
Or 5 or 6 months.
Or whatever. Yeah. 3 quarters is usually what I'm predicting as a minimum when I'm talking about this transition to companies, because, and it might be longer. It just depends on the product, depends on the market, depends on a number of things, because ultimately, and this is another point that I try to make to anybody who will listen, this is my number one soapbox. And that is that the buyer's process is the buyer's process. And if we as marketers and sellers and as companies try to make that our process, then we're disconnected. And we're not only going to have very disappointing, predictions of revenue, but more importantly, we're going to turn people off to our brand. Because we're trying to force them to buy the way we'd like them to buy. And so, when you start working with a new company and you start sizing up their situation, I'm asking things like, all right, what's your actual runway to this revenue growth that you'd like to see? Are you going to run out of money or patience or organizational commitment long before your ICP is even going to be on board? Because a lot of situations, those two things are disconnected. They really need to see revenue in 6 weeks, but their actual buyer's process
Yeah.
is 12 weeks, is 18 weeks, is 24 weeks, is whatever, right? So, if you don't really know your buyer, and if you don't have a truly buyer-centered revenue strategy and the capital and the organizational wherewithal to support that on-ramp of that process,
Yeah.
then you're kind of at a non-start period. And so unfortunately, what a lot of companies do, instead of acknowledging that, instead of going from 0.7 down to 0 so that you can finally get to 1, they just ramp up and scale up bad practices, bad tactics based on the wrong strategy for their ICP. And then, of course, their CAC goes through the roof. Churn goes through the roof, even if they do close sales in SaaS, or you just burn your brand in the market.
Yep.
But it's so common.
Yep.
It's one of the main reasons businesses fail, is that they've not actually understood what it would take to take them from where they are to where they need to go. And often it's dismantling what you've done and thinking about it in a different way.
So there's an entrepreneurial streak in you. Like, it's clear, like anybody who's listening to this can see it, right? Or hear it. And so I'm kind of curious, like, what has that done for you as you're thinking? Because you're not thinking like, I'm the head of sales. You're thinking like, I'm looking at it from the top of the funnel holistically all the way through to, it sounds like even through, to customer success, where you're saying these are the things that are most important to driving revenue in a sort of holistic fashion, right? But marketing and sales, like if you're like, you operate in that, for lack of a better word, that vacuum, right? That's your job title. That's what you do every day. Most people don't think that way if you're in marketing or sales or rev ops or whatever. So talk to me like really quickly, like you think like a business person. That's what I get, right? You think like an entrepreneur. So where does that come from?
Yeah. So remember when I said in that building materials company, I was the only sales and marketing person?
Yeah.
Well, I had a few other hats too. And those all happened organically because there was nobody else to do it.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, I built a relationship with an architect and helped him through the specification process, create collaborative design, engaging with the builder, helping all the documentation that needed to go into the sale, all of that stuff. Even drove the check back from New York State to Virginia personally, right?
Yeah.
And so, it was very personal to me at that point. But then, wait a minute, we only have 3 people in the factory. They've got to keep building product. This thing actually has to be installed. So I'm renting a truck and driving the product to New York to be installed and staying there for 4 days to see it done. And I'm learning all about what happens on the ground with our type of product in a commercial build, right? Yep. And then I'm dealing with all of the closeout documents. I'm dealing with the end user, because guess who gets on the airplane when there's something wrong with it 6 weeks into the opening? Well, it's me.
Yeah. I love that.
And so it's just all happened at once for me. And so I see it as one thing. Right. And this is where, we talk about team revenue, and people are like, well, yeah, you're talking about, the people that bring in the money. Well, okay, maybe yes, but I define it as a unified multidisciplinary team made up of not just sales and marketing, but stakeholders from the whole organization who are aligned, and they're working together to drive long-term, stable, recurring, and profitable revenue. It's not just how many sales did you close this week. It's how many evangelists for your product did you build over the last 4 quarters who are now better salespeople than you are, because they're just saying, hey, these guys were there for me when it got difficult. They put an exec on the plane to come to me to make sure I was taken care of. Those are the things that get me up in the morning and get me moving, because it's people, right? It's when I have a handshake, when I make eye contact and I say, hey, my company and I are going to provide this for you. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, I want to be the guy who can live with what I actually do. And I want my kids to look at me and say, my dad means what he says, and he'll do what it takes, not just at home, not just in hobbies, not just in fun, but in every part of his life. And that's the person that I want to be. That's cool. So that's how it happened. I mean, it just
Yeah,
kind
you
of
you
have.
got you got the crash course like MBA. Well, I don't know. MBA maybe is not as relevant maybe as it used to be, but in terms of the crash course and how to do this right, and it's fascinating to me. I mean, everybody talks about like wanting to be a lifelong learner, and it feels like you're modeling that, which is really cool. So all right, so I've got a question for you,
Okay.
because you're going to use both halves of your brain, right? Right and left half, when it comes to, let's call it, sales and marketing. Um, so talk to me about alignment. Talk to me about how marketing and sales can get better alignment within an organization where there's a strong sales leader and
Hmm.
a strong marketing leader.
Hmm.
um, what are the key things that you look at inside the business, to see what's busted and what to sort of triage?
Yeah, and this is a really critical question, Eric, and I really appreciate the way you asked it as well, because um, it's kind of a setup for failure in a lot of cases. And the reason I say that is usually when you have a strong sales leader and a strong marketing leader, and they are not unified under the same umbrella, um, and I'm going to use umbrella in multiple ways here,
Hmm.
they have different agendas. They have different
Sure.
goals. They have different metrics. They have different comp.
Hmm.
They have different philosophies that are
Yep.
actually somewhat at war with each other. And in many cases, neither of which are centered on the buyer.
Yep.
And so the only way to approach this, in my view, is for everybody to lay down their ego. It's cliche to say it, but to ask, are we collectively obsessed with understanding and serving our buyer? Are we obsessed with making what we do match what they want and need in order for them to receive value from who we are and what we do? If
Yep.
that's not at the core in the culture of the company itself, and I would argue that goes well beyond sales and marketing, it goes to every aspect of the company. If we're not all obsessed with providing actual value, then in most industries, the revenue might be there for a while, but ultimately you're going to burn through your
Sure.
addressable market.
Hmm.
And so that has to come from the top. It has to be modeled, it has to be cultivated, it has to be fought for internally, because what typically happens is every CEO has said forever that we're a team. We're a mission sharing, vision sharing team. We're on the same page. We're going for the same goals, but we don't align how we actually make decisions to match that.
Hmm.
And in many cases, you hire the Wolf of Wall Street on one side, and then you hire the latest, greatest, marketing tech wizard on the other side. And you're never going to align those two mindsets around the customer. And that's got to be embedded
Hmm.
into the very culture of the company from the top down. And
Hmm.
and I would say the companies that have achieved the most long-term success in most industries are the ones that actually understand A, who their customer is, B, are obsessed with building and evolving an organization around the answers to those questions. And
Hmm.
I would actually point to LinkedIn as one of the strongest examples of this. And if you go back to Jeff Weiner's leadership there, he is the master of personal and organizational alignment. And if you go to LinkedIn Learning and you click on Leading Like a CEO, which is his course, he spends the first chunk of that time before he starts talking about anything tactical, anything strategic. He talks about aligning yourself with yourself as a leader,
Hmm.
and then aligning your organization with its actual values, mission, vision, values, culture. And, you can overdo that to the point that all you do is talk about hypothetical stuff. But your employees are going to know if you're actually aligned with what you're saying when you make decisions and how you handle conflicts and what you prioritize in
Hmm.
those decisions and conflict resolutions. People know. And they're either saying, wow, he or she really meant what he or she said, or they're saying, just another phony leader.
Yep.
And ultimately, somebody with credibility, people will follow up a hill. on a shared mission. And if it's centered around the customer, then you can break down those silos because we're both obsessed with the same thing. And it's the person that's actually buying.
Yeah. So you said something really interesting. You said we were specifically talking through the lens of sales and marketing. I absolutely agree with you. By the way, it runs through product, it runs through your development team, engineering team, it runs through your customer success team. All of that is better. You create a better organization when it's customer buyer driven, right? Feedback driven.
Right.
And there's both hard and soft measurements for those teams. Where
Right.
it gets real, like, it's where the rubber really hits the road, like measurement wise, hard numbers is going to be in, like you said earlier in the conversations, like, oh, you came back from your thing and it was like, oh, well, how many deals did you close?
Right.
And
Absolutely.
so there's a short-term pressure that's put on sales and marketing that is very clear at the end of every month how you did, right? There's a performance, and you should be high performance driven in sales and marketing. I think where I see challenges in in an organization where you have strong marketing and sales leaders is, as you said, like, I mean, obviously there's ego and personal things and all of that, but really, in my experience, like, sales and marketing just flat out does not talk the same language.
Right.
Their expectations are different. As you said, their compensation packages are different. There is no alignment because the organization is not aligning them. And so if you have an organization where sales and marketing are talking about the same things, and I'm specifically kind of thinking about B2B in this particular scenario, right? Although I think to some extent, it's growing on the other side of the house too. But in terms of like what that looks like, right? Marketers by and large do not talk about things like, LTV, and, they don't talk about ARR. They don't talk about, like, what was your closed one, win rate this month, right? They're getting that report fed to them probably, right, at the end of the month or end of the quarter or whatever, when they're talking to, the other leaders at the table. But they themselves, in their day-to-day, the things that drive the decisions are made between the meetings, right? That's really what's happening, right? So those decisions that are those micro decisions that really lead the team, or direct the team and get things done during the week, is really happening outside of some meeting, right?
Yeah, and I think that's really critical. It's really critical because when we say, all right, marketing, we want you to go out there and whatever we say right after that, our metrics and our comp and everything else better match up with what comes after that part of the sentence. And the same thing is true on the sales side, where, all right, sales, we want you to go out there and do what? Right. And then if those two things don't line up between sales and marketing, then in many cases, you've just set up two sides of the house to fight. To have discord, right? And then those micro decisions that happen in between the meetings are where the rubber meets the road.
I think all you have to do, to your point, like really, like, all you have to do is just sort of, it's human nature at the end of the day. You follow how people are incentivized and rewarded. And reward doesn't have to be financial, but rewarded, pat on the back. What are they asking you for? Are they telling you, you're doing well or not well? Those things are what's directing those micro movements, that they're making, that are decisions that are happening throughout the week. And if those are not lined up around revenue, what you end up with is an organization that is over here doing this, and another organization and and the business is doing this. And I think, so let's talk really quickly, if we can, like, what metrics, if you're talking to the marketing team, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to use that as an example because a lot of our audience is marketers. And
Yeah.
if you're talking to the marketing team, what are the things that you are looking for them to be paying attention to?
Yeah. So it's deeper engagement related metrics, because I believe the most long-term sustainable marketing efforts are long-term minded. So how are we engaging with our ICP in a way that they're engaging with us, that they are appreciating the value that we're bringing to them without us asking for anything in returns? No strings attached value being provided, because what's happening there is, in exchange for that value, our recognition, our credibility, our sense that we can be the solution when they realize they're ready to buy is growing within that ICP's mind. And so the goal is for marketing, in my mind, to deliver to a sales team highly educated and high intent buyers very low in the sales funnel process, because they've already done their research.
Yep.
They already know who the company is. They already know maybe even some of the salespeople, because those salespeople were involved in some of the community and content-based efforts that the marketing team is heading up. And so the transition from Google search, I don't know what I'm looking for, to bottom funnel sales process activities is mostly in the dark. And the way you measure that is with, hey, how many people are showing up, carving out time for the live event that we're producing on a regular basis, that maybe not even about our product, probably isn't about our product, but is bringing relevant industry minds to the table to provide value about the business that our ICP is in. And so when you do that, what you're saying is, not only, do we kind of know who you are, but we're saying we care about your business. We get your business. We're here to provide value to you. Now, this is the kind of thing that makes bean counters crazy. But if you invest time in those things, and you can measure it by who's asking questions, who's carving out time to be a part of it, these are the metrics that I'm looking for, right? So, the ungated, ebooks, and the just organic LinkedIn and Twitter and other content that may not be product, but it's industry, it's thought leadership, it's whatever. And by the way, I think you can do this by giving other people a venue for bringing value that aren't even within your company. And it shows that you're just a good company that cares about the industry that they're addressing. There are all those metrics of participation, of engagement, of time invested, videos consumed, all that sort of stuff. That's what I'm looking for on the marketing side. Now, there are sales metrics that I think marketing should be evaluated on. And this is where maybe some people would disagree with me, but I would say, there needs to be a way for an AE to score the level of intent and education of every person they talk to, right? And then the third thing that they would want to be able to score is the actual buying power within an organization of the people that they're talking to. And so I think marketing, to some degree, on all inbound that sales interacts with, should be evaluated on those three metrics, as well as the long-term revenue metrics that really are what the big win looks like, right? So there are sales metrics that I think of, what's traditionally sales metrics, that I think the marketing team should be evaluated on, because otherwise what you're saying is, we don't care who you give us the contact information for. If you give us a piece of contact information, then it's a win for you. Well, we should have the same wins.
Yep.
Ultimately.
That's right. Yeah. So, I think it's evidenced by, you get to the end of the month or the end of the quarter, and marketing is exhausted, but feeling good about what they did and all of the work that they put in, and the different campaigns they run, and they feel good about themselves. But sales is on the other side of the phone, or on the other side of the fence, sort of looking at it and saying, well, I mean, I'm happy for you, but we're half a quota. In my view, marketing failed in that given month, because it is a revenue, at the end of the day, marketing is still there to serve the revenue of the business, right? And you do have you do have levers in marketing that does directly influence pipeline and contribute to revenue and closed won deals. And the way that you do that is by all of the things that you just talked about, right? I think where a lot of marketers fall down, and you tell me if you agree or not, but where a lot of marketers fall down is they don't know how to talk to non-marketing executives about the things that they are doing and how it connects to the business outcomes like pipeline and revenue, right?
No, I agree with you. I think I would only nuance it slightly to say that it is the responsibility of the CEO to make sure that that level of shared viewpoint and communication is happening across the organization, and specifically in what I call adjacent teams. So sales and marketing, obviously adjacent teams,
Sure.
I like to think of it as one team. I think some of the companies that, and this is that concept of team revenue, right?
Yep.
The companies that have a single point person for sales and revenue with an integrated philosophy have an opportunity just from the get-go, from their very structure, to break down the silos, to be in alignment just organically based on how they're structured. And at the same time, you can still have a silo between the revenue team, the sales marketing team, and other parts of the company if leaders as a whole aren't rewarded for the big team win. And if they're not rewarded for cultivating that alignment across the whole company, that's really ultimately what drives most people is, hey, what's going to increase my comp at the end of the quarter or the end of the year? And I think if a company really wants alignment, literally put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah. Totally agree. Yep. I so there's this is fascinating to me, by the way, because I think, one of the things that we fail at a lot of the time, in just businesses and B2B is really struggling with trying to navigate that kind of environment and like, so everybody, I think anybody who's listening sort of like, yeah, this makes sense, right? This is a rational thing and I get it. I think where things tend to break down is sort of like in the data, like everything else, right? It's devil's in the details. It's how do you execute on a daily basis, and that's where that communication and expectations conversation has to happen, right? So it's marketing is talking to sales, and it doesn't have to literally be meetings every single day. It's marketing needs to be talking to sales through reporting, right? Marketing needs to be talking to sales through setting, goal setting and expectations. Marketing needs to be able to talk to sales about, what are the types of quality, that you're going to be getting. And so that sales is on the other side, building out staffing to be able to support that. And, ultimately translating to whatever the financial goals for the company are, right? I mean, it all starts from there, right? You always know, hey, here's what my number is for this year, and you sort of back into it all the way to whatever ads you're running, in the awareness channel, right? So I guess there has to be a connective tissue, at least in my experience anyway, right? That ties all of that together. And, I mean, at the end of the day, it is like continuous sort of reporting and communication and expectation, goal setting and expectations. So I'm curious, like in terms of like just the companies that you work with, the company that you're at today, like the type of MarTech stack that they use for things like reporting, things that you're using for communication, setting the expectations, putting the goals together. Like, do you have any advice for, let's say, new marketing or sales leaders that are coming in? How should they think about what they're inheriting, and then sort of their go forward plan?
Yeah. So great question. My advice is start with the customer and ask yourself after you spend some time, and I'm doing this at Vistio right now. Spend some time. Obviously, you got to know the product. Obviously, you got to know your company culture, all the major players. But once you kind of get your basic onboarding done,
Mm-hmm.
spend time with the customer, the ICP or ICPs, depending on if you have more than one, which a lot of companies do.
Mm-hmm.
And then ask, after you get to know them, if the metrics that are currently being measured, and this is company wide, but specifically with sales or marketing, that we are calling success metrics, have anything whatsoever to do with the customer's buying experience that they actually want to have. And to a greater or lesser degree, if that answer is no, then change is needed.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're not going to be able to look at top line revenue day one and learn very much. The ultimate answers come from understanding the customer and seeing if the revenue strategy matches what actually is happening in the mind and work life of your B2B buyer, and the way that they
Mm-hmm.
think, what their pain points are, the way they buy or their company buys, and whether your product is a good fit or not. If you're not even addressing them the way they need to be addressed in order to lubricate the sales process, if you will, then you might have the right product, but you're going to see much lower close rates, much higher churn. You're going to see your revenue numbers be dependent upon somebody who could close anybody.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's not going to be that long-term stable recurring revenue. So my advice is get settled with internal things, and then get to know your customer really, really well. And that's whether you're in sales or in marketing. And hopefully there's a lot of reaching across the aisle. There's a lot of philosophical alignment. Maybe there's a shared leader at the top, who is constantly preaching sort of like an alignment vision, who's constantly referring everyone back to the customer and all the knowledge that we have about our customer or customers. But that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm trying to encourage sales and marketing leaders to do, because the metrics that you're going to want to be celebrating or really building out as key metrics, your KPIs, if they're centered on what we want the customer to do instead of what the customer needs and how the customer buys, then you're not measuring the right things.
Yep. Yeah, totally agree. I think that's really good advice for anybody who's coming in. And it's funny, like, I don't know, I started this position maybe October, I think. So what is that, 5 months ago?
Yeah.
And I spent every like extra minute I had, and you know what this is like, right? You're in this new role that you're in now, and you don't have a lot of free minutes. And what I tried to do was just spend a ton of time having conversations. And it was fun. It's funny. It actually morphed into this podcast, was me just talking to customers. And then I was like, well, this is silly, because I actually want to create sort of this internal library of conversations that I'm having with customers that I can then share through to, the other folks on the marketing team and sales team and that sort of thing. And then, it evolved into the podcast. Well, it's funny because 2 days ago I was just walking through our office, and I passed one of the developers, and he was sitting at the table, and we were just chatting a little bit, and he said, yeah, like I caught your podcast the other day. I was listening to some of the stuff you were doing when you were talking to some digital marketing agencies. And yeah, I mean, I listened to it from time to time. I was like, wow, man, that's pretty cool. I hadn't distributed it. I hadn't told anybody about it. I hadn't, really like explained what we were trying to do with it or anything else. And that was encouraging for me, right? To hear that our own team members, our own developers, and folks that are not sales or marketing related are listening and saying, what are the customers actually wanting to know, right? And, or what are they saying, and what do they need, and how do they use our product, and all of that kind of stuff. And I thought that was fascinating to me. It was really
Yeah.
cool.
I mean, that's
Um,
ideal, right? When you start to have,
yeah,
a content engine that starts bringing all the pieces together,
yeah,
especially if it's organic and semi-accidental.
yeah,
And then suddenly you have more people internally that are listening to the customer than ever before.
yeah. I think the one thing too is like, when you get that sort of framework set up, and you have that level of understanding, getting your metrics in order, right? Getting your tools to tell you what's actually happening with the customer, because the customer can tell you things outside of the conversation, right? They can tell you things through
100%.
analytics. They can tell you things through like what their buying behavior looks like. They can tell you things through, the way that they are coming through your funnel, and where they're falling out, right? They can tell you things in other ways too, that are quantitative. And I think the thing that I've always learned is, because whenever I've come into and like sort of parachuted into a new organization, it's always been, you know, by and large, it's always a mess. I mean, that's like very few times have I ever gone to a company where it's just like the data is pristine, the tracking and everything is working, and you have a really clear understanding of how people are coming through your funnel and buying,
Yeah.
and where they're falling out, right? And so I think, really understanding that, having something that's in place, regardless of what it is, just getting really clean data that shows you the entire view from, the ad that you're running, all the way through to what's happening on site, all the way through to connecting to what's happening in your pipeline to a
Yeah.
closed one deal, right?
Yeah.
And like, if you can't see that view, you don't know what's causing the closed one deals. There's a lot of, supposition. There's a lot of, like interpretation, that sort of thing, but it's not the entire full holistic view that you need. And I think that's one thing that a lot of companies are missing, is that sort of like holistic full funnel view.
So I'm going to turn the tables on you if you'd allow me to. I have a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
So you basically just described a pretty linear attribution. I mean, I believe that attribution is going to become increasingly difficult.
Sure.
And, being able to provide a holistic line drawing from, marketing efforts to closed one is going to be increasingly difficult. Do you agree? And if so, what is necessary in your mind to replace attribution in the justification thinking for expenditures in marketing?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. It, ties back to the earlier conversation we were talking about, we were talking about attribution. We just didn't call it that, right?
Right.
That's what we were doing. And I actually, the way I would answer that is, by the way, I think it's a great question. The way I would answer that is that I would argue that marketing has never been clear line, full, like, straight line to a conversion, right? I think that's our way as revenue or as marketers, to communicate and talk about buying in a way that we can sort of tell the story to non-marketers, right? That's where the funnel came from, right? So the funnel is not like this, right? The funnel is actually like this, and so, when people are moving through in and out of stages, and it's always been that way, but we have sort of fooled ourselves into thinking over the last, I'm going to say like 10, 15 years, we've sort of fooled ourselves into thinking that attribution is like the single sourse of truth.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, and it's funny you bring this up, because I was on RevTech Summit. I was speaking at RevTech Summit on Tuesday or Wednesday this week, And the entire presentation that I did, the entire thing was all about how like the title of it was attribution is flawed. And not broken, but flawed, because we, especially like, we want really badly to be able to look at something and say they go from this step to this step to this step to this step, and you just have your conversion rates in the funnel, and then you have something that's at the end. Instead, what's really, it's like, have you ever seen Plinko in, like, you know what I'm talking about? So you like, you put the put the dollars in the top, right? And your customer bounces around, and it comes out the bottom, but you don't know which channel it's going to get tracked in. But it's usually going to be things like, paid search branded, like branded terms. It's going to be, things like direct type. It's going to be things like organic, right? And, those pieces are being like, that's not the outcome, right? That's just the last click.
Yeah.
Right. So what's driving that buyer behavior is actually something else that's 1 or 2 steps or 5 steps, right, prior to that. And the trick for marketing, as anybody who's listening to this sort of knows, if you've been doing it a while, is trying to create or recreate more of that kind of behavior, so that it is, it has that driving effect for things that are happening at the, towards the bottom of the funnel.
Yeah.
And
totally.
and so I actually, one of the things that I did is funny. I'll send you the thing. I'll send you the deck afterwards. But one of the things that I did is I took, like, how did you hear about us on our lead capture form that we have on our site? And I think it was like 1,170 of them that we had captured. And then I reverse engineered back from those leads, like where the customer actually told us they came from, and bounced that up against where our attribution tool said that they came from, and then looked at the disparity between the two. And it was huge, right? So example would be like, hey, I came from a podcast, but then, our attribution tool says it was a direct type in. Well, that stands to reason, right? But we don't ever, like, as marketers, this is what I mean about communicating to non-marketers. We don't do a very good job of doing that kind of connection. We haven't figured out how to really, like, articulate it super well to, the people that are holding the purse strings, right? And making those kinds of decisions. And so that's a huge thing. And then the other thing that I do is I actually look, so we use our own product, which is SharpSpring, and it's a CRM and a marketing automation platform all in one, right? It's all under one roof. And what we do is, on the marketing team, is we'll look at all the closed won deals that are coming through, right? And we do sort of a retro of those closed won deals. And we will look at what we call the life of the lead, which is essentially that, from ad, click, impression, whatever, all the way through, what's happening on site, what kind of content they're consuming, what kind, like, did they go to the pricing page first, or was it like 3 or 4, interactions later? Like, where are they at, right? Did they engage with us in a chat bot? Like, all of these different pieces. Did they open a bunch of emails that we had written? What kind of content did they consume, right? And, like, where are they at, in the buying, decision-making process before they actually went to the demo request form, filled it out, and got into our sales pipeline and then closed, right? So we do that as a retro to see what's sort of driving that sort of outcome that we want, which is more of those types of closed won deals. Like, and it also tells us the opposite, which is all of the things that we don't want, right? The things that are all going to a closed lost, like, and so encouraging the behavior we want, discouraging and filtering out, right, the things that we don't want, or providing exclusions, right, for things that we don't want. And then showing all the way through to a closed won. And then our sales team does the exact same retro for the closed won deals. but they do it for the pipeline, and then they do it for like what was the engagement happening on the site, and through through those stages that became that was sort of driving or influencing that close one deal. So totally agree with you. It is not fully linear, and but you have to have those different touch points or something, you know, to track and measure all of the things all the way through from beginning to end as much as you can to see, right, that it does this, not this.
Yeah. And I always tell companies, you're essentially grading on a curve, right? There's a certain percentage of which the attribution is unhelpful.
Yep.
And I think my prediction is that that curve will get bigger. It will become less helpful. So
Yeah.
I'd like to introduce just a concept real quick, because I know we've been on for a while, but there's a book called Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense by Rory Sutherland. And, I think every business leader, especially CFOs and finance people, should read this book. And it's going to drive those types of people crazy. But the reality is that people don't actually use logic in buying decisions. They do, but they don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I have a brand of clothing that I'm kind of obsessed with. I don't really have a good reason for that. Just to be honest, I'm being self-reflective, but I feel something for that brand.
Yeah.
And in B2B, it's typically a little bit less like that. But I think there's an overly attribution-focused way of approaching most of what we do in sales and marketing, because the purse strings are held by people who only have left brain most of the time. And in reality, most buyers, even the best buyers, well, they're all people, but there are people who are experiencing emotions. There are people who are going through things. There are people who are looking to make their work better, their lives better. And all of that is not actually going to be a logical process or experience. So I think I don't want to end our time with saying, oh, there's no hope in figuring it out. But instead, I want to say we have to understand the caveats of the humanity that are on both sides, including our own biases and our own predilections to do it the way we've done it before. And to do what's comfortable for us, and essentially just acknowledge those things and incorporate those things into our decision making.
Yeah, I think this goes back to, it's obviously the conversation's died down. It's going to pick back up again in 6 months. But, when third-party cookies was a big topic about a year ago, the world was ending. Marketing as we know it is going to end, et cetera, et cetera. I'm over exaggerating, but that's what it felt like to anybody who was doing any kind of targeting or digital advertising at the time that Google said, we're going to start, we're going to deprecate this in Chrome. And I sort of looked at that as an opportunity for marketers to sort of get back to what marketing is really about. And this is the common thread through this entire podcast episode. And it is, what are the things that you do to engage and build trust and educate your market and build product consideration, right, for your product, right? And do it in a way that is helpful and inspire, it could be inspirational, like whatever it is that you do from a content perspective and a distribution perspective to help bring people along and align with who you are as a brand and what you stand for, right? And how your product solves whatever their pain point is. And marketing is about filtering out poor buyers as much as it is, and wasting their time as it is about marketing to them to bring them into your pipeline, right?
100%.
For the ones that make sense and have affinity for your product and or your brand and potentially your product could solve their problem. And I think that is the thing that you focus on, regardless of whether it's 100% trackable or not. Again, it's not 100%, like attribution is not like a single source of truth. It's for best used for directional purposes, right? That's
No, I
the
agree. And I
best way
think
I can describe it.
the myth is that it was ever the single source of truth,
Totally
right?
agree. Totally agree. Totally agree.
And so I think it's an unfortunate starting point for a lot of companies' philosophy of go to market.
For sure. Yeah. And it limits, right? I talk to our head of sales all the time. And one of the things that he says is like, look, it's not just about the pond. It's about increasing the size of the pond that you get to go and fish in later. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is marketing's job, right? Is to help increase the size of the pond with the right kind of fish
Yep.
that sales can then go and fish in. So
100%.
So I tell you, Rob, this is a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it. We went down into some like really deep into some conversations that I thought were like exactly what probably marketers are going through right now, early on in first quarter, right? This is what they're struggling with as they've built out a plan, and now they're trying to. It's like the rubber's hitting the road, and they're actually trying to hit a plan, right? And so this was fantastic. I appreciate your spending the time.
Yeah, I appreciate you inviting me on very much.
So Rob, tell the audience a little bit about like maybe how they could get a hold of you, or they want to learn a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I would say go to my LinkedIn, just search for Rob Connelly, Connelly, and I'm the guy whose tagline says facilitating personal, professional, and revenue growth. That's me.
That's cool.
Love to hear from anybody.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob.